Hi, welcome. My name's Jill Vialet, and I am pleased to welcome you to the Ashoka bi-weekly gathering where they invite social entrepreneurs to come and talk about what they're thinking about, how they're reacting to this moment, what they see working, and what they hope is coming in the future. Today, we're talking about rethinking schools and the future for kids, and I'm joined by three amazing social entrepreneurs, Kara Bobroff, Will Jackson, and Dana Mortensen. Um, Briefly before we jump in, we've got a full 45 minutes planned, but I wanted to do some quick housekeeping. First, just to introduce myself, I'm an Ashoka Fellow as well, joining the other three. I founded three different nonprofit organizations, the Museum of Children's Art, Playworks, which is a national nonprofit focused on the power of play, and more recently, Substantial, which is looking to redesign substitute teaching. I will make just one quick pitch. I've been actually thinking a lot about this topic, about the future of schools and what it holds for kids, and just released a free ebook that I'd love to encourage folks to check out at playworks.org/workbook. Please download that and then send me your thoughts. But as we get in, I wanted to bring the folks up, and we're going to do a little thing different. Oh, and the housekeeping things, expect things to run about 45 minutes. We'll be sharing links in Zoom chat as we go, so social media handles, websites, and then we'd love to hear from you. So if you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and as time allows, I'll be pulling those out. So we wanted to do something a little different by way of introduction today. So I've asked our panelists, instead of introducing themselves or me doing it, I've asked them to introduce each other. So it's often an interesting thing to hear how others see you. So I thought we'd go from that to start. And Will, you want to kick us off and go first with your intro of?
Sure,
Okay,
sure.
great,
I'll go
perfect.
first. So I have the great pleasure of introducing a friend. I think I can call Kara a friend, Bobroff. Kara, I'll share a brief story. She was actually the one who sent me the letter to kind of introduce me to the Ashoka Fellowship. And I remember her kind words. And I was out in New Mexico and I kind of randomly texted her. And she made time out of her day to kind of actually come and visit me, I think like the very next day. And so I just share that kind of in a genuine way to let y'all know like how warm and I think loving a person Kara is. And I think it reminds me of her leadership as I was kind of reflecting and reading through what she has done, just the fearlessness to start a school based on Native culture and for her people and by her people back in 2005, when we're not where we are right now in terms of people's awareness of kind of equity issues, just really struck me. And really, I guess I would say a lack of fear that I saw, right? Like, and also a clear no to say like, no, we will not allow white supremacy to lead how we instruct our children, but rather we will say yes to our own culture, to our own foundations. And so that was a deep part of her starting NACA, which is a school directly designed to support indigenous people and their tribes and their culture and their languages. And you can read more about it. And it went so well that folks wanted to come and take their ideas and spread it across the country. And so that's the type of leader Kara is in terms of her ability to bring people together, her ability to inspire others, and her ability really to have a lasting impact. And so I'm grateful for her because a lot of the work that she's done is definitely very inspirational to me and in the work that I do. So thank you, Kara.
Perfect. All right, and Kara, we're going to turn it over to you to introduce Dana.
Thank you, Will. And I have the honor and opportunity to introduce Dana Mortensen, who is the co-founder and also the CEO of World Savvy. And I think that as I was getting to familiarize myself with your work, Dana, and also just for our audience this morning, one thing that really stuck out was an interview that she had on PBS. And one of the quotes that she shared was really, I think, great for this moment, and also something that I think will help maybe ground a little bit about what we're talking about today. But saying we're not preparing students for a standardized world. And Dana, I just want to say, when I heard that, I just wish I had heard it earlier and more people could hear that across our country. I think students and families gravitate towards the work that Dana is leading. Since 2002, she's really built an organization that has expanded and working with a number of middle schools and high schools across our country. Being a former middle school teacher and principal, I think that we always need folks who can anchor us in ways of thinking and doing what we know is best for kids in a different way when we have really standardized, heavy bureaucracies and systems driving at accountability measures that don't always allow for that. So thinking about World Savvy, they're looking to really think about how can we support students and the dispositions they need to thrive in a diverse and interconnected world. So just want to say thank you for the charge that you're leading and the ambitious goals that you've also laid out going into 2030 to serve 5 million middle school and high school students across the country through 10,000 different schools, and also continuing to lift up that voice of looking at standardization as something that we don't need to do more of. In fact, we need to stop and start thinking of how do we really create better learning opportunities for our students and communities within our country. So just want to say thank you for you and your team, and excited to engage in this conversation today.
Perfect. And Dana, will you introduce us to Will?
Yes, and thanks, Kara, for the intro. I had the pleasure of meeting Will recently, just in the last year, and have become sort of borderline obsessed with his work because it so deeply resonates with my own thinking and philosophy about what's wrong in education and what we need to return to look at how culturally and racially affirming environments and diversity in our schools should be leveraged as an asset, and that's the strength of who we are as a people and as a country, and that's something that standardized ed hasn't done a good job of. So Will is the founder of Village of Wisdom, and spent his childhood growing up in Atlanta, where he had the good fortune to be among family and community that was a racially affirming environment, and so firsthand got to experience what that does and what kind of motivation that gives, and went on to become a bit of a chemistry star, I learned as I was reading through all of your biographical info, but then decided to teach in middle school. And something that stuck with me that was really powerful, that decision seemed to be motivated by the knowledge that potentially other young Black students, if he was a professor, he might not get to see them and impact their own trajectory at a time that was so pivotal. And so after spending 4 years doing that, Will really was able to dive in and find the evidence that should be obvious, right? Which is that the more racially affirmed Black children are, the more resilient they are when they face the negative effects of racial bias, which we know and are confronting now in ways that are critical more than ever, is everywhere. It's the water we swim in. And so I think the organization Village of Wisdom set out to answer this question that is inextricably linked to what the success of the education system needs to be and can do, which is, why aren't we systematically and systemically working to racially affirm Black kids, and why can't we do that across the country? And so Village of Wisdom really exists as an organization, but really feels like a movement, not just to affirm Black genius, but to work with Black families and to protect Black genius and uplift that and ensure that the experience Will was able to have is something that's normalized. It's just something we come to expect as a part of how we define quality education. So they do that through a lot of ways. I encourage you to check them out online: family organizing, advocacy. They do consulting work, and they're really trying to look at this racial injustice in schools and help support students, teachers, and parents with actual actionable tools to make a difference. So it's been a real privilege to get to know Will's work, and you are inspiring. So it's amazing to be in conversation with you both today.
Definitely an inspiring crew all around. And so want to lean right into, with this sort of moment and the larger sort of title of this panel, Rethinking Schools and How Children Grow Up. It's such an easy moment to get sort of caught up in all the negativity. But one of the things that's always brought me sort of delight in hanging out with other social entrepreneurs, other Ashoka Fellows, is this sort of unstoppable desire to like imagine a future that is much better. So in this moment, I'm interested in hearing from all of you a little bit about what you're seeing and framing it not as like, how do we return to what was sort of perceived as normal, but what are the opportunities that are bubbling up for each of you around building back in a way that is better and serves our kids and families and frankly our democracy in a way that we haven't done before. So you can jump in, whoever wants to go first. I'm gonna call on you then if you don't jump in though. So Kara, why don't you jump us in?
Okay, thanks, Jill. So, as I think about this, I, recently had the opportunity, NACA started in 2006, and really at the core of that conversation was our community coming together to ask the question of how do we better serve Native American students. And the driver was our community, and it was families, educators, tribal leaders, business owners, entrepreneurs, anybody who really cared deeply for Native American students, whether that was through their own personal experience or their hope of having their child attend NACA one day. We started with no preconceived idea about what the school would do, how it would function, or what the outcomes would be. But it was through meaningful, significant conversation about that moment in time, grounded in the historical context of our communities, knowing that, the United States education system was, created schools that systematically remove culture, language, identity, and had really preconceived expectations for our communities about what we would do within our lives. So knowing that and feeling that through line all the way up into my own experience as an educator, my own experience as a student, and others in my community, it was clear that we wanted to change that. And it wasn't about going into the system and kind of redesigning what was already in place, but really creating something new. So I think that the more that we can engage families and students at this moment in what it is that they would like to see education be, and not limit it to an industrialized model necessarily, or that is already in place, the better that we can move forward. Now, given that vantage point, here we are 15 years later, we're celebrating our 15th year anniversary. I think that, we've seen other Indigenous educators not only talk about the way that schools are created or education can be mapped out, but really what is at the center of how we learn, how we teach, how we support one another. And it's not limited just to, a standardized model of education, but what is Indigenous education? That's another movement that I think applies to all students and families globally, and also within our, our home communities. It's not about kind of a one size fits all model, but it's more about holistic wellness and development of students and families and communities, identity development, understanding that, language and culture and identity is a strength, and that our students and families bring that to the educational process and learning. And then also that we think about college and career in a really different dynamic way. I think that the models around just getting kids to college isn't enough, but it's really about what are the passions that our students and families have and what's the right path to achieve that. College is definitely one of those things, but also thinking about social change and innovation in a time that students are thinking about that. They've been bottled up as much as we have. I served as deputy secretary recently, and I'll stop talking here in just a second, but as we entered into this distance learning and remote learning, and also looking just at all of the things that surround our students and families on the reservation and or in our tribal communities, it was super clear that there's so much in the way of all of our students being able to even access education right now. So I think that we can't operate in the model of there's a school building, kids are going to go there, but there's really so much more that's surrounding that. And I heard a lot of our tribal leaders talking really not anything that's necessarily new, other than that they see the commitment to language and culture being really, really key and even more urgent now. The second is that looking at agriculture and getting kids outside. So I know that our staff and faculty and our communities, thinking about land-based learning as a driver and also a core piece of what's going to be different moving forward, which is really, really exciting in so many different ways. If you think about, the connection to space and place and how do you heal, I think that's going to be another, we already have that as part of the fabric of our school and our network, because we know that, education really is a place where our communities need to find a sense of healing, given the history, but now even more so, the disconnection, making sure we're reconnected, and the relationships are solid, as well as thinking about students as learners and what it is that they're bringing, and how do we provide the right mentorship and teaching for each individual student, knowing we're going to rebuild something very, very different. So those are just some initial thoughts.
That frames the entire conversation. Excellent. Let me go. Will, I would love you to respond to sort of the point around space and base and how do we heal. And then I'd love to turn it over to Dana to talk a little bit about the path to college and career. I think those would be two areas that I feel like you both, and then obviously free to riff however you choose. But Will, responding kind of and how what Kara just laid out relates to what you've been working on.
Yeah, I mean, what we've been thinking about and really actually actively working on is putting parents in a position, Black parents specifically, in a position to drive conversations about what learning should look like. What does culturally affirming learning look like for Black families and Black children? What does that learning look like in digital spaces, right? Since we're over dependent on digital spaces right now. But also, importantly, what does that learning look like inside of the home, right? Because I think it would be, it's a lost opportunity if we are overly dependent on what learning looks like in a digital space, right? But what we've been doing is actually training parents on focus group analysis, right? Or the ability to run their own focus groups. And so we've had Black parents basically talking to students, parents, and teachers, asking them what their dreams are for cultural affirmation or culturally affirming learning environments. And then what we're going to do is actually turn that back to another group of parents who've been doing homeschool for a long time as Black parents, and asking them, okay, well, if you were going to make user-centered tools and strategies for what culturally affirming learning looks like in a digital or at-home space, then what would that look like? What kind of offerings could we provide to parents, students, and teachers, especially given the constraints that they discussed, right? And so when I think about place, I'm thinking about place in this particular time, but also we know that like as schools have readjusted and tried to get one-to-one, and people have invested all this money to like now make sure that folks have a lot more access to digital, that stuff isn't necessarily going away, right? Like even if COVID ends tomorrow, we're going to see a lot more online learning. We're going to see a lot more learning that depends on what happens inside of the home. And so how do we begin to prepare our communities for that? And I think most importantly, what I'm excited about is this idea that Black parents get to be the validators of what cultural affirmation looks like to them, as opposed to some group of white folks coming in and trying to tell us what culturally affirming or culturally responsive means for our particular community.
Perfect. Dana?
Yeah, both Kara and Will bring up what I think are pretty critical points, and to kind of come back before we circle around to the college and career. I mean, I think this is a really unusual opportunity, and I say that with full knowledge about the fact that this is incredibly challenging and has had an incredibly negative impact on so many members of our communities, to sort of interrogate the inertia in education that's really existed. I mean, if you're thinking about what you want to change, we are concurrently experiencing these multiple pandemics at the same time, right? Very, very infrequently in life do you all experience something like this, the COVID, a health pandemic, or the national conversation and overdue reckoning with racial inequality. These are conversations that everybody is aware of, that are having with a degree of urgency that we haven't had. And environmental, right? Fire, as we spent our intro call catching up on air quality for folks around the country. And I think what that presents is an opportunity to sort of really interrogate that for schools and districts and classrooms that tend to get stuck in, the ways of doing, right? And as Kara referenced, a lot of the way we built our education system was to respond to an industrial era that just doesn't exist anymore. Not if you're talking about for career and
So I've got Dana frozen. I don't know if other people do too. Okay. I'm hoping she'll come back and it's not just me. I was trying to wait patiently because it looked like maybe Will and Kara won't moving either. So, but let me go back then, and hopefully she'll come back in. She can finish that thought. Kara, can I get you, and both of you, Kara and Will, can I get you all to dive in a little and talk, when we talk about kind of co-creating and the conversations that you're having with parents and families, Can you talk a little concretely about the translation of the moment from the conversation to actually putting the ideas that come forth into practice? Like, I was a classroom teacher, and you're the one grown up with the kids, and like it just feels like how you actually translate this as a theoretical construct into actual change in the classroom. Can you paint what that looks like and how it really happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'll try to juxtapose two things, right? I remember walking into a classroom, and it was a school where half the student population was Black and half the student population was Latinx. And it was a math classroom, and on the walls, it said like all the contributors to math, like since the beginning of time or something like that, right? And of course, basically it was like 12 different white guys, right? And I'm just like, as a student who's coming into this school and you're telling me to learn about math, you're basically telling me that the people that look like me have nothing to contribute to this conversation, because apparently everybody that ever did anything worth talking about is on this wall right here, right? Even though like there's really great examples of how folks on both of the southern continents in this world have contributed like large geometric structures that look like triangles, and pyramids way before any of these people were alive, right? But yet we credit some white guy named Euclid and Pythagoras for coming up with what a triangle is. So I think that's how you get it wrong, right, in practice. And how you get it right is by highlighting these intellectual contributions, right? It's by saying like that people like, and this is what happened in my own home, right? I talk about how my mom, who's a teacher, who did this in her own classroom and did it at home, brainwashed me into believing that all scientists were Black, right? So every time we talked about scientists, it was George Washington Carver, it was Benjamin Banneker, it was Dr. Mae Jemison, it was Dr. Charles Drew, right? And so now when you start talking about what science looks like, you're talking about their contributions. And so now kids get to see that, right? And so I think a lot of times it's about the content that we produce and present inside of the classroom, because now kids can see themselves reflected in that. And then I think the other piece to it is just like how those things are connected to social justice, right? So if we're talking about air quality, right, and you're talking about physical science inside of your classroom, this is a perfect time to talk about like how particles and all those different things come together and impact like the science that kids are learning in the classroom. So like, how are we taking actual social issues and transferring that into the classroom? Are we talking about just the American Constitution? Are we talking about tribal nations' constitutions? Are we talking about South American constitutions? But a lot of times what we'll do is we'll just focus on our American Constitution, and then we wonder why kids don't have a more global view. Well, we spent 3 months talking about, one article, and that just doesn't make sense. And I don't think I think that those are all examples of how we.
Yeah, that's perfect. I also, just in defense of Euclid, I know the pictures of him are white, but I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have been like really a white dude. And if I just, in defense of Euclid, Dana, we missed you. We're glad you're back. We wanted to segue just really briefly to like sort of thinking about practical examples, but I do want to give you a chance to finish out your thought, unless you're too disjointed from your experience. Do you want
no.
Okay.
And I'm sorry about that. The irony of talking about the future and how technology will change it, and the internet in my office cuts out. But what Will was just mentioning is, I think, very much kind of what I'm thinking about is this opportunity. Do you have a group of young people? Education is not often centered around students or student-driven, where you can use inquiry-based and project-based models at this point to connect what's happening in their lives to what's what they're learning in the classroom. I'm based in Minneapolis. There isn't a student in the district here or in this community that hasn't been impacted in the last 6 months around the conversation about racial inequity, for example, how COVID is disproportionately impacting different communities. These are things that young people want to talk about and have the capacity to talk about. And if that's what relevance really is. I mean, Will was just giving great examples of it. School shouldn't be something you get through. It should be something that's there, that affirms who you are, helps to build a worldview that sets you on a path to thrive in whatever way is meaningful to you when you're done. And so I think the other thing I was trying to make the point about this, living through this concurrent experience together that we're all sharing, is also just proof positive, more to the point of what Will was bringing up, that, we are what are we preparing young people for in school, right? A world where these challenges are interconnected, they're interdependent, they're super complex, and they're super nuanced, and we can't solve them by ourselves. And so if anything, it's an opportunity to look at K-12 and say, well, how are we building those competencies in a way that helps all kids be ready for that kind of discourse and that kind of problem solving, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because rote memorization is certainly not going to get you there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that, how do we rethink it? And the other piece you asked me about originally, and that includes things like unpacking this complex and really distorted mainstream narrative about our own history, right? You can't think about the future unless there was a tweet yesterday that resonated me with, I went to K-12 public schools. I can tell you the names of the boats Columbus came over on, but not the indigenous land where we were based, my elementary school was. But that's problematic, right? In order to think about what thriving means in the future, we've got to know where we've been, and we've got to confront it in a way that's more honest. And I think the fear, the patriotic education conversation that's come up recently around what happens when you confront that honestly, this is a moment to say, what our country was founded on aspirational ideas that went awry in a lot of ways, right? We have a dark history we've got to confront and look at and understand, and to understand how not to repeat that in so many different ways. And I think underestimating young people's capacity and desire to do that, to seek truth, to speak to it, and to be change makers for the future is really is problematic.
Yeah.
And then, the last thing about career development, to the extent that we think about school as a place for college and career readiness, which we do, right? It's discussed so often to prepare kids for what's next, is, relevance in that context is changed so much. I mean, when I was in middle school, would you have imagined there'd be like a cryptocurrency banker or a vertical farmer or a drone operator, or, the majority of jobs my first and third grader are going to have when they're out of school probably don't even exist yet. There's problems in technology that they don't even exist yet. And so to think about preparing young people in that context for a job, they're not going to go work in the same field for 40 years, most likely, stay at the same place. And so this pandemic and the time we're living in, to sort of rethink and reimagine what does flexibility, adaptability, the ability to be sort of live in ambiguity and in uncertainty and change, and figure out how to navigate that, is a little bit antithetical to how school was set up, right? There's a right answer and there's a wrong answer, right? It's not a model that really is set up to teach kids about the gray areas and the nuance that's so much of what solving problems is about. So I think it's an opportunity to do that, to really interrogate ways that practically in the classroom, we can bring that back to the forefront.
So so building off that, and I've been sort of fascinated by the idea that this moment actually presents so many ideas for like one giant project-based learning experience. Like in terms of like, if you want to engage with problem solving, like this moment is like ripe with opportunity. Kara, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which students and staff and families you've seen being engaged with your schools and the network of schools you support, how they've been really given opportunity, license to really be not folks who just are compliant with what's given to them, but engaged with actually building the schools that best work for them.
Yeah, I think the kind of in the current moment, I think some of the work that our teachers have been engaged in is really around how do we continue, what in our mission are we able to do in this current context and do well? And then what are we going to, kind of have to pause on, but not ever giving up the core idea around Indigenous education. So what does it look like and how are we going to do it differently? And so that's been one area that we've worked with both families and students around. And I think like access to healthy food, access to like Indigenous like perspectives in like thinking about food sovereignty has been a key area. I would say holistic wellness and being able to understand, even though we're not together as one community, that we're able to connect through, ceremony in a different way. I think that's been something that I've seen our students and families really yearning for, is that connection to one another. And especially, this time of year when we're seeing like, an absence of being able to have feast days or, a coming of age ceremony that a student may be engaged in. It just has to look different, but it doesn't mean it has to go away. So that's been something that I think the preservation of those different traditions within the school and within the community themselves has been something that we've really focused on. As far as like school design, we have fellows that are, have just opened schools. And so I'm sure, in addition to other networks as well, that there's kind of this like, how's that going to look and what's that going to be like? But parents sticking together around the mission that they worked on and the vision for the past 2 years around the co-creation of new schools. I think of one in South Dakota out in Rosebud. Also, how do you continue that effort going forward? In I think of it not only school by school, where fellows are taking a year or 2 years to really engage in meaningful conversations grounded in like lived experience. This is a huge lived experience we're all going through right now. And I would say the opportunity to do that needs to be not only done in like pockets of where you may find entrepreneurial efforts, but also at large scale. And I know Dana talked about like how districts have to respond differently. I would really love to see like an entire system think about reimagining and rebuilding at this time. And I would say in the conversations I had as at the state recently, some of those organizations that are poised to inform states on reentry are really going back to like, how do we just go back into normal? And I think that we need to disrupt that, because if we don't disrupt it now, we're not going to have something different on the other end. Thinking just about the scale of how many students are out there. The BIE is an example of that, who serves, 7% of Native American students. And then each state agency is then responsible for that other 93% across the nation. And I feel like that there's I don't know what the driver is, whether it's fear or whether it's, kind of like that's what we know. So we have to redesign our lessons. I was talking to a friend of mine in a heavily served Native American district about her concerns as a parent. She said, even though they're in a hybrid model, they're, my child's going to class, sitting in class with their computer while there's other kids like at home on their computer. And that's like what the learning looks like in a hybrid model. So I think that my question, I guess, to my fellow fellows here is like, how do we disrupt that system in a way that's going to be truly meaningful for it to not only, I don't know if pause is the right thing, but to really truly redesign what it is we're doing at a level that's going to impact most of the students that are out there. I guess that's a big question, whether that's a district or a state agency. But right now, it seems like every state agency is kind of picking up the playbook of, here's your guidance, this is what you should do. We need to pay attention to students with disabilities. We need to make sure that we're thinking of equity, and equity is like getting those kids to come to school if we can, and continuing to provide the same curriculum and the same kind of types of learning. So that to me is like what needs to be disrupted and changed. So I would like to see a co-creation of a state education agency or a federal agency at a federal level that allows for the room for parents to determine and families to determine what it is and students, of course, to think about what it is they really want to see. So if we can do that, then I think we can really like change like the trajectory of what we've been experiencing.
And you called in students right there at the end. There's a question from the audience from Charles Stites. It looks like it says, how should a 15-year-old young person in your community think about the next 10 years of their life and how it should unfold? What narratives should our system support? Anybody want to take a pass at answering Charles's question?
I mean, I guess if he's using saying like in our community, right? Like I reflect on a 15-year-old like that's living in Durham, and how that is going to unfold. I hesitate to kind of tell that child like what I think they should do or be thinking about, and my question would be more about like what they want. I think if I'm thinking about a 15-year-old in our community, the different things that they're probably facing in terms of probably housing insecurity, a fair amount of violence that's going on, probably seeing a lot of their loved ones who are older than them, like dealing with employment issues, maybe them themselves like worried about employment, and also probably dealing with somebody in their life who's lost their life, probably both due to COVID and maybe something else. And the degree to which like our system has contributed to all of that, right? And so frequently the message that I think that 15-year-old is hearing is that like, you need to get out of your community and you need to get away from these people, because these people are the reason why y'all are suffering, as opposed to really asking them to kind of step back and look at, well, who are the people that are harder to see, right? Who are the power brokers who are harder to see, that are actually making it difficult for your loved ones to access healthcare, that are making it difficult for your loved ones to access healthy food, that are making it difficult for your loved ones to access employment, in their own stories and narratives, because so often the stories and narratives that are pushed on them just don't see them in a positive light. And there's so much unlearning that we have to do. So I would have a lot of questions for them about, when's the last time you've been affirmed? When's the last time somebody made you feel good about being Black? When's the last time you felt good about the food that was taken into your body? And who do you think is responsible for that? And what is your plan, right? And how would you do it better? Because I think we have to start asking people about what they would do with power, to get them to get in their minds about, like, I can be powerful, right? I have power, and I have the power to in many ways write my destiny. But that doesn't come without having to fight against oppression.
I could not agree more. And I think the answer to that is setting up systems so that agency for young people is affirmed. This idea that, I mean, we've gotten very used to in education talking about the potential of youth in the future, right? They're the future leaders, they're the future problem solvers. But in reality, you know, to Will's point, what they're experiencing and seeing around them, and how aware they are of what's been in, you know, how their communities are impacted and how their lives are, really the best thing you can do for that 15-year-old is to create a system where their own agency is supported, to build that, to say, what is it that you care about? What do you think should be done? What perspectives do you have that haven't been shared? I mean, I think anybody listening to this that's been to an education conference or, you know, work in education reform circles, very infrequently are they intergenerational groups of change makers. You know, it's not even today, right? Where we're actually asking young people, we're putting them at the center, and that's by and large true, other than incidental ways in the systems, in K-12 systems. And so I think that's a really important piece, right? Not to guess, not to put upon young people what they should have or what they should want, but to ask them the question and to give them the space, institutionally, to answer that. I think that's really important. And the other thing is, it's been slow to move away from a stand and deliver model, right? It's not really what teacher ed by and large does. Setting up models where teachers are facilitators of student-driven learning, where they're able to do the kinds of things that Kara and Will do so well, set up culturally affirming and culturally responsive classrooms, those things, that's a really different way of thinking about teaching and learning. And it's placing a lot of trust in youth agency to drive their own learning. And I think that, to me, is at the core of relevance. And that's the opportunity Kara mentioned, right? To really question, what is relevance, and what does engaged learning look like, and how can we think differently about it now? Because I agree, I think it's a pause button, even though that's insulting to anyone on this call who's like, it doesn't feel like a pause button. You're in a classroom teaching, you don't feel like you're on pause. You probably feel more burned out and stretched thin than you ever have. At the same time, at a systemic level, it is, right? You know, people are having to do things they say they never could. So there's opportunity in that chaos to come back in a totally different way that is completely reimagined.
So I do want to flag, I know that on future calls of this kind, there are going to be some students pulled in. I know Ashoka is leaning in to focus on that. I guess what the whole thrust of this conversation and around creating culturally responsive classrooms, I'm interested how the three of you would frame sort of the connection between education and power and sovereignty across systems. It's something I've heard Will talk a lot about, that's really got to be the sort of emphasis on how we think about building schools in this next piece. But like concretely, like how do you see what we do in education as being pivotal to actually redressing the inequities that we face? Waiting for Kara unclicked. Go.
Yeah, I think something that like Will was talking about that really resonates with me is like where the power lies, right? So when we opened up, we talked about democracy as well, and like, you know, there's like a contribution to this to our Constitution, like from Native American women and Iroquois, right? So you think about like that context, like what was the actual intention? So I think it's about what's the true intention that we want to see that would be different? That's, if we're really, really, really wanting to do this, then we have to let go of, or not we, I guess certain people have to let go of the power that they have over the education system. And, we figured out a way to do that through creating, collaborative charters. I think, tribes have, tribal sovereignty, which is like, a federal relationship with the government that really does allow them to do what they want to do with their education system, unless they want to receive certain types of funding. So I think there's that, aspect that's a roadblock in some ways. So I think really letting go of like closed systems and opening them up to students and families to have be the drivers in like what the school does and like what education looks like, and thinking about different pathways. We have one of our Indigenous studies teachers and our professional development lead are looking at working with students, this semester and next semester on individual pathways within the context of our school. The foundational aspect of NACA is a holistic wellness philosophy, where students and families and teachers and anybody related with the school really reflects upon their intellectual development and their passions for what they want to learn, their social, emotional, overall well-being, relationships within that, and kinship, as well as their physical health and wellness and their connection to their community, the intentionality of Indigenous identity. So if you use that as a platform to create a learning plan for students, for families, for communities, I would see that that's, we would have to have the room for that to actually be realized. And I think that's like the big shift, is that you're starting with like a holistic well-being of the student and the family. And then from there, either developing the learning itself and or developing a school based on that. And that's what we've seen some of our fellows do in regard to Indigenous education, just opening up that question. What is an Indigenous education, and what do we want for our students and families, and building it from there.
Great. Daniel, you want to take a pass?
Yeah, sure. I didn't know if Will was going to jump in, but I agree with what Kara said. And I think just, I can't remember exactly how you asked your question, Jill, but to think about my K-12 experience was public schools in New Jersey, what would have been, well-ranked good schools. But what I learned and what I knew about history versus what I had to explore on my own out of K-12 it's mind-blowing what was missed. And so I think the connection between, where power resides is what we make choices when we decide what to teach and what perspectives to elevate and who to center in the content that we put into schools and the way we learn about everything from history to science to the arts. And so if I had a K-12, I'm in my mid 40s, had a K-12 experience where I could go through 3 years of an English class and not read anything in school written by a person of color, what does that say to, this is true for a lot of people who have come up through our public education system. So what you understand about history, what you understand about how it's told and who got to tell it, what we understand about science, Will was mentioning that earlier. I think those things end up crystallizing and supporting stereotypes, ways of seeing the world and the people in our communities and around us that are not an accurate sort of reflection of what's happened. And so I think there's a huge connection. I mean, it's not, you can't get away from that. And so, and I think the attempts to sort of preserve a narrative that was simple and sort of one-sided, and where, there's good and evil is really antithetical to what it's going to mean to live together in a diverse and interconnected society. So I think there's myriad examples. I mean,
Great. And Will?
Yeah, I think when we talk about power, it's important to be able to kind of be explicit about what we mean, right? And so what we've tried to do is to make it, one, give some language to what institutional levers of power are, right? So one of those institutional levers is to be able to know who the leader is that's making a decision like Dana just talked about, right? So who's making the curriculum decisions inside of your district, inside of your school, inside of whatever you're talking about, right? So there needs to be a leadership clarity, right? And then there needs to be accountability, right? So we need to understand who that leader is accountable to and how that power operates. And the more we can align their accountability to the communities that they're serving, the more likely it is that the decisions that that leader is going to make is going to be in line with culturally affirming that particular leader. And then the other thing that's happening now is because like, okay, well, we'll hire an equity director inside of a district to kind of help out with this, to kind of control some of these issues. But then you don't give that particular leader any real power, or if you do give them power, you don't give them any resources, right? So now you go and you look up the equity director's budget, and there's a $500 million budget, 50 million of that is actually what can be spent, and they got $50,000. Right, so like, but you're in a district where basically all the kids that you're serving are Black and brown, those are all the ones who are dealing with the biggest inequity issues, because this is America. And so you haven't actually given the types of resources necessary to solve that problem, right? So that's another lever of power, especially institutional power inside of districts, that I think we need to be crystal clear on. And then ultimately, there's 4 of them, but I won't talk about all of them. But the last one I'll talk about is strategy, right? So what is the strategy that you've actually put together to do this thing, right? So like, we always talk about, we want to create culturally affirming instructional environments. What people automatically come back to us and say is that, well, we had a day for Latinx history, or a Latinx cultural day, or we did an Indigenous day, or whatever. Like, no. You have these kids inside of your classrooms. They learn by connecting prior knowledge to new information. And if you aren't talking about changing the instructional patterns inside of your classroom, you are wasting your breath and your time. So stop talking to me about the day that you did and the recipes that you brought into the classroom. How did you embed that into the actual learning opportunities that kids had? And I want to see well-aligned activities to strategies, because what oftentimes is like, we try to throw all of these activities at the book, and they don't actually align to a particular strategy. So I think we have to kind of be really crystal clear about, are we talking about leadership accountability? Are we talking about clear strategies? And are we talking about resource allocation in ways that make sense and reflect what we would want for our communities of color?
A super quick piggyback on that, Jill, is that honestly, in addition to what Will said about having a director inside a district or another place, it's a great, important, well-intentioned effort. Even if they have all the resources, it's still everybody's work. It's still, you don't want an environment that's like, oh, that's Will's job, because Will's the director of equity, and so Will handle that. Because creating those kinds of, rethinking pedagogy, rethinking instructional practices, it's everybody's work. And so I think that's the other piece. And because in the absence of that, you do end up with this food flag festival sort of approach to trying to diversify perspectives inside curriculum and so on.
We are at time, so I'm conscious. I want to, Will, just give you a heads up that Adam chatted in that you were nailing the power conversation. Keep pushing that message and strategies required to play this game of change. So getting some love from the audience. Always want to share that. One final whip around. I just would love if you could, like, in one sentence or two, like if you could just share a wish you have for how children grow up in this next chapter of American life. And then we will wrap up with that.
So I would say connected to their land, like a deep understanding of identity, focused on innovation, social change, and pursuing a well-rounded life.
Right on.
Okay.
Dana, you want to go?
Sure, I would say empowered and supported as change makers, right? That they have the capacity and the capability to actually lead in the moment and create the world that they want to live in.
Will?
Yeah, so we talk about Black genius being the ability to create new systems of equity and justice, or the ability to dismantle systems of oppression. So I hope that our kids grow up with people protecting their Black genius and their ability to do those things.
Yeah. Thank you all so very, very much. Thank you to everyone who dialed in and tuned in and has been watching. I hope you found the insights here today, something you can carry into your day and week. A reminder that this is part of a bi-weekly series powered by Ashoka, and our next conversation is in 2 weeks, and we'll hear from Ashoka Fellow Eric Liu of Citizen University, who is a total badass and doing really powerful, important work around our democracy. He's going to be talking about recommitting to democracy, and so be sure to sign up at the link in the chat and to share recklessly with your friends. Thank you again, all. It's an honor and a joy to get to work with you. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you so much.